Yeah, good afternoon. I'm Norman Fenton and I'm here with Dr. Scott McLachlan, and we're going to be talking about the Lucy Letby case. Now, Lucy Letby, for those who don't know, is a nurse who's just recently been found guilty of 7 counts of murder and 7 counts of attempted murder of babies at the Countess of Chester Hospital during 2015-2016. And although the mainstream media is portraying her as Britain's most evil baby murderer, there are a few legal and other researchers who've seriously questioned the quality of evidence in the case and have suggested there may have been systemic causes of the baby deaths at the hospital which were nothing to do with Lucy Letby. Now, Dr. Scott McLachlan is one such researcher. He completed his PhD on the topic of learning health systems under my supervision in 2019 at Queen Mary, University of London, and he's been following this case for a while now and is especially well qualified to comment on it. That's because in addition to his PhD, he's not only originally qualified as a nurse, but also has several legal degrees and is currently a lecturer in digital technologies for health in the Division of Applied Technologies for Clinical Care with the Faculty of Nursing at King's College. So, welcome, Scott. Now, before I ask the first question, I should say that what piqued my interest in the case recently was the chart that the prosecution used to show that Lucy was on shift at all the 17 baby collapses that the court examined, while the other nurses were only present at a few. And I put out a tweet saying that Scott had pointed out in his substack that there were baby deaths when Lucy Letby wasn't present. And I said you can create exactly such a table for every specific nurse by restricting deaths to babies who die when that specific nurse is on duty. So, Scott, can you tell us what you know about other similar baby deaths that happened in that Countess of Chester Hospital during the time that Lucy was working there, and also whether there were any similar deaths shortly before and after she was there?
Right, so what we know historically for the hospital is, on average they had 2 or 3 neonates die in the unit each year. So there was a constant background noise. There was a regular pattern. And so what was noticed in 2015 and 2016 was an abnormal increase in that pattern. Now, what we see through a Freedom of Information request that was sent to the hospital during last year, what we can see is the hospital acknowledge that there were around 30 or 31 neonatal deaths on the unit during the 2-year period that was investigated in the court case. However, Lucy only, and that's deaths. That's not collapses. There were much more collapses than that, but there were around 30 or 31 deaths. However, Lucy was only ever considered for 8 of those deaths, and as many people will know, right at the very start of the court case, when the judge was reviewing the evidence that was going to be put before the jury, the judge actually ordered that one of those cases be removed from the docket, and so the prosecution dropped one of those 8 babies. Now, so what we know looking is that there were these 30 or 31 deaths that happened in that 2-year period. We know that some of those babies, you always expect there to be a small background. These are babies, neonates, who are often, they're very poorly when they're born. They are often premature. So many of these babies are anything from, I think there were 1 or 2 that were almost term, but the average sort of prematurity on the unit was something like 7 weeks, and it went as high as 10 or 12. Based on the prematurity of the baby and the weight of the baby, the unit were normally required to refer the worst, the babies who were the most premature, or the babies who were under 800 grams, they were required to refer those babies out to a more specialist unit. And then during that period, the Countess of Chester upgraded their unit so that they could keep some of the more severe, the more sickly babies. So you had a situation where you had a unit with a lot of babies, and they were very busy. You had staff who were supposed to be looking after those babies in a one-to-one relationship of staff to neonate, and unfortunately for most of that period what we see is actually that many of the staff were looking after 2 or sometimes 3 instead of one. So you have a situation where the staff are working outside the guidelines, and we therefore know that there were a much larger number of babies who died. And so that chart that you posted, which is a chart that the police presented, a very, very similar looking chart during the court case, and they showed it to the jury on at least 3 occasions that I saw. The mainstream media have produced various versions of that chart. Really, all that's happened is their method of investigation to arrive at that chart has been to go and look at all of the babies who died and then filter that list down to the point where you've got a list where it's 100%, you've got 100% Lucy in a column. And so, as you say, quite rightly, we could go and do that for any of the other 36 or so nurses who were on the unit. And bear in mind, that chart did not include the doctors, right? So imagine doing that for the doctors, and you could probably get the doctors to a range of 12 or 15 or even 18 of the 30 babies that expired on the unit. If you did that for anyone else, and you presented it, you could go, okay, well, look, this person's correlated. And in fact, in one of my substacks, I point to the fact that one of the nurses that worked with Lucy Letby was correlated with at least 3 of the first 4 babies that I analysed. So why wasn't she in the frame for it? Why was it just that, we've made a chart with Lucy? I'm wondering whether what they did was started with all 30 babies and kept taking a baby out, until they found the nurse that had the most correlations and went, okay, that's the nurse we're investigating.
And what about the numbers after Lucy Letby?
Well, that's another interesting thing, because when you look at it depends on who you source for the numbers. So if you source the freedom of information that came from the hospital themselves, there was a lull of about 7 or so months between when Lucy was taken off the unit and when the next baby expired. But then when you look at some of the other, you look at the Embrace report or you look at the ONS report for Chester, you see that from about May the following year, which is supposedly when the police investigation started, so May 2017, you start to see the number of deaths actually go up again, and they peak. When you look at the ONS data, they peak in 2018, 2019. At a rate that is actually slightly higher than when Lucy worked there.
Well, okay. So can you tell me anything about the consultant, Dr. Gibbs, who I understand was in charge of the unit, and what happened after he left? Well,
there's sort of some interesting information that I got when going through all of the sort of transcripts of evidence that were... This is the evidence that was presented in court by various different doctors and nurses. One of the things that struck me as I started to review even the first sort of 4 or 5 babies A through D and more recently baby E, when you look at situations with the doctors, there's often talk of the doctors going and ringing, and these are junior doctors, so whilst by the time they got to court, we were called in the court, they were calling them consultants. These were doctors who most of them were either trainee or they're in their first or second year out of getting their degree. There's often talk of them having to go and call Dr. Gibbs, right, as in call him on the phone. And so, we find a situation with one of the babies where the mother actually kept insisting that, my baby's not right, my baby's not right. One of the doctors in the theatre had said the baby looked like it had a infection, and they actually gave the baby a bolus of antibiotics at the point where it was born in the theatre. And yet it took 4 to 6 hours for that child to be moved onto the neonatal ward. And one of the interesting things was that the junior doctor who eventually moved the baby to the neonatal ward actually did say in his testimony that he had to go and phone Dr. Gibbs. Now, Dr. Gibbs ended up retiring not long after, in the sort of 18-month period after Lucy Letby was removed from working at the hospital. And it does seem like he was almost, you'd say, sort of 1 foot out the door for most of the period. And it does feel from the evidence like the 4 junior doctors, and there was a trainee doctor as well who was working there at the time, it does feel like they almost had the run of the place.
And you feel they weren't sufficiently well qualified then?
It is pretty obvious from the evidence that we see that these doctors, instead of being the usual process would be, for example, I as you know, while I was doing my PhD with you, I had some eye surgery. I had 2 eye operations, and the usual process would be that yes, you meet one of the junior doctors initially to have they do various tests and things on you. You then meet with the consultant surgeon who's going to do the work. The surgeon does the work and demonstrates to 1 or 2 of his or her registrars during the process of doing the surgery. And then often what will happen is one of the registrars will see you after the surgery, and then a few weeks later you'll see the consultant who will follow up and make sure that what they did was correct. What we see in this particular situation is we see, for example, in one case, a trainee doctor who attempted to insert an umbilical venous catheter, which is, whilst it's not the easiest procedure, it's not the most difficult, but the protocol says that you shouldn't do it more than 3 to 5 times before you go and get an actual consultant to come and do the job. And usually if you're a trainee, you'd often be supervised a couple of times by a more senior doctor first. Yet we see instances where trainee doctors and doctors who were in their first year out of medical school were performing 5, 6, 7, sometimes 8 attempts before calling a more senior doctor to come and perform the insertion. Now, one of the things that we do know is that when you're inserting these types of catheters and you're doing it multiple times, and it's exactly why the protocol says don't do it too many times, you run the risk of introducing potential pathogens that are in the unit. You run the risk of harming the baby. You're basically inserting something into a line that goes directly from the umbilical to the baby's heart. So that's a pattern we see across the evidence for a lot of these infants, is that there was multiple insertions done by junior doctors at the time, and then these babies go on to have all of these other issues. But instead of focusing on, okay, is it possible that something during all of these repeat over and over and over procedures that did it? No, let's focus on the nurse who happened to be there at the end.
You also had, I know, some serious concerns about the quality of the evidence presented by the expert witnesses in the case.
That's another interesting area because it came out in cross-examination. Now, the police did quite well, the prosecution did quite well to present Dr. Evans as being a neonatal paediatric expert. Yet it came out in cross-examination that whilst he'd maybe done a short stint in a neonatal unit back in his very, very early days as a paediatrician, he not only was 15 years out of working, he'd been retired for quite an extended period, he'd only done the very barest minimum of neonatal work, which therefore meant that he wasn't, perhaps as knowledgeable and competent in the neonatal area as he was perhaps in some of the other areas that he did work. But also there was this issue that since retiring, Dr. Evans had set himself up, and he set up a private company that specifically was him being a professional expert witness. He wasn't approached by the police, will you come and have a look at this evidence? He admitted he actually drove from Wales all the way to Cheshire Police, presented himself to Cheshire Police, and basically touted for business. I'm here, I'm an expert in this, I can help you to find out the guilty party. So, he turned up on the door, offered himself. It looks as though from the tax returns to HMRC that he's made considerable income from being involved in the investigation and being involved in the trial. We can't say for certain that the invoices that he declares are invoices that relate to this trial, but it does look as though he's made an income from this. And yet his evidence, in legal terms, what we'd probably class it as is something called ipsi dixit, which is it's opinion evidence, because he's giving evidence about something, he's giving expert evidence for something that he's not actually an expert in.
Scott, can you explain why you feel the defence in this case was somewhat inadequate?
Right. So, Lucy's defence attorney at the time has been a King's Counsel barrister called Ben Myers. Now, Ben has done, I think, an admirable job in what I potentially believe are very difficult circumstances. I think something has happened along the way that has tied Ben's hands behind his back, that has limited either what he's allowed to investigate or limited the types of questions or the types of evidence he's allowed to challenge or present. And I think that's evident in the fact that, well, like we discussed at the start, there were a whole group, there was 2/3 more babies that died on the unit in the period than Lucy was charged with. Normally what I would expect to see is that you would go and look at all of the babies and see, did any of those babies, and you'd want to do this both as a police investigating it and as the defence attorney trying to work out what the defence for your client is. I would have expected that there would be some discussion about, okay, there's these other babies, some of the other babies we can already tell died in similar circumstances with some similar conditions. They were referred out, some of the babies were referred out to Arrow Park and Alderhay, so there are records all over the place for them. There are nurses and midwives in both places who have interacted with these other babies. So I would have expected to have seen something during the trial, if not from the prosecution, then definitely from the defence, going, well, look, there were a lot more babies that died. Why are we only focusing on these ones that can be pinned on Lucy? And yet that never happened. And then when you have a look towards the end, there was a spreadsheet that came out of the court that listed the witnesses that each party had declared. So it's normal at the start of a trial like this that each party will declare to the court, these are the witnesses we intend to bring, and often you'll also present some sort of a will say statement for this is why we're bringing this person. Now when you look at the list that was released back towards sort of October, November last year, the list for Lucy's defence mainly consisted of Lucy and her parents and people like that, and with the plumber tacked on at the end. Now in the end, the only witness that was presented on Lucy's behalf was the plumber. And so, we didn't end up, we heard from Lucy, but we didn't end up hearing from her parents. We didn't end up hearing from any of the other nursing staff who apparently still support her. She still has many of the nurses she trained with, and even some of the nurses that she worked with, who are still supporting her. And we saw one on television over the weekend who and was reported in the newspaper that she said, I'll never believe that this is true, that Lucy did this. So why didn't we hear from any of these people?
Just picking up on that point about the plumber, because that was kind of like an interesting thing. Can you tell us a bit more about why the plumbing evidence was considered by the defence to be important?
That's what I'm wondering, because it didn't feel to me like Ben really developed that particular witness. Now, the reason I say that is because what we do know from what the plumber said, and we know now there's been some FOIs to the hospital with regards to the records of the unit with regards to the maintenance and the plumbing. What we know is that there were regular instances, in fact the plumbers were being called out, the maintenance people were being called out to the unit on about a weekly basis. Now this is a two-storey unit, so you've got where the neonatal ward was, which was in one corner of the hospital on the ground floor. You've then got another unit which I believe was called Ward 35 that sat on top. Now it was apparently quite common for the pipes that were in the ceiling space, the above the false ceiling in the neonatal unit, for those pipes to have problems with either being blocked or with microfractures or bursts. Now why that's important is because these are wastewater pipes. These cast iron pipes are carrying fecal matter. They're carrying, if somebody bleeds in the operating theatre and parts of the operating theatre get cleaned up, then that's going down a drain in the floor, and that drain's passing across. And we know from the evidence from the plumber that originally the drain from that unit upstairs ran across the middle of this floating ceiling above the neonatal room 1. So at the point where that was having little micro leaks and where it had a more major significant leak and it was getting blocked, you're talking about a pipe that is directly above the cots that these neonates were sleeping in. Now, you might not think that that's important, except that what we know from other hospitals who've experienced issues with hospital wastewater is that hospital wastewater carries and breeds a number of pathogens. Some of them are bacterial and some of them are viral. So we're talking about things like Acinetobacter, we're talking about endotoxins and endoviruses. And these are the things that in some cases you will see normally you or I would have some of these things inside us. But while ever they're in the parts of our body where they're supposed to be, where they're normal, such as in our intestines, they don't cause us any problem. It's when they end up somewhere else. And in this particular instance, what we know is that if you've got these hospital pathogens that are getting out into the environment, they can not only survive and create a film across surfaces. So for example, if you'd pulled down those floating ceiling tiles, you might very well have seen a thin film of these pathogens growing on the inner surface. But we also know, for example, that even in, and one of the examples I give on my Substack is that even in a brand new unit that was built. So the example I give is a hospital that was built. They built a brand new neonatal unit, had everything brand new, new plumbing, new surfaces, new tiling, new floors, the whole lot. From the time that the builders got sign-off on that they'd done everything that they needed to do to the time when the ward staff came in and started setting up the ward was 30 days. In that 30 days, in that brand new unit, one of these pathogens had taken hold inside the plumbing, the cold water, the freshwater plumbing coming into a sink. That pathogen then resulted in the deaths of a number of babies, right, in that brand new hospital unit, simply because once that pathogen had gotten into that particular set of piping, it grew and grew and grew, and of course, you know, as more water's coming through, that water's washing it out. It's being washed onto the nurses' hands when they're washing their hands. They're using the water from from this source to do things like mix the feeds that are given to the babies, and so it led to a number of deaths. Now, an interesting story behind that was that when they initially started looking at those deaths, they did the same thing that happened in Chester. They looked at what nurses can we link.
Yeah,
and it wasn't until they started testing. They brought in a epidemiologist and his team, who's an academic team, who came through and they started testing all the surfaces, all the taps, etc. And that was when they found that it was actually in this freshwater tap.
So presumably in the Lucy Letby case, there was no such sort of forensic investigation of the surfaces.
There is no evidence from the court case, and there's no evidence from the hospital records that they ever
they didn't investigate
tested
that,
to see whether,
despite the fact that there were these known problems of the sewage.
Well,
system
despite the
leaking,
fact they'd not only had sewage leaking in that space above, but they'd also, by the plumber's own admission and by Lucy's evidence, which led to the plumber being there, they'd also had hospital wastewater from the toilets, etc., mixing with the wastewater from the showers, and it came up through the floor, such that at one point they were walking through it.
And if I understand it correctly, that the plumber said they were more or less being called in on a weekly basis, and the prosecution tried to dismiss this as, well, that happens in any hospital. Would that be? Do you think that would be the case? The way that
the prosecution sought to actually, I suppose, sort of deflect from it, was the prosecution at one point on redirect, which is what you do after the person's been cross-examined. The prosecution sought to, it happened in the room next door, so that won't have affected this room.
Right. Okay.
Another of the examples that I give on my Substack is the fact that on more than one occasion we've seen situations where patients have been found to become infected with these nosocomial pathogens, even when the pathogen is found on the opposite side of the hospital, and it's taken an investigation, again, an epidemiological investigation, to find what is the route that the pathogen took through the hospital to eventually end up at the patient who's over here.
Okay, so this sort of leads into my next question, because basically the jury, of course, were convinced that Lucy Letby was guilty. So if she wasn't guilty, what other possible explanations might there be for the deaths of these babies? Is it the case that, are you proposing that these potential pathogens was one such explanation? And Are there any others as well?
Well, there's potentially, I've focused my research at the moment specifically on a group of very common bacterial pathogens, and I know that there's another researcher at the moment who's looking at a pair of very, very common viral, the enterovirus type, because at the within the sort of a year or two either side of these deaths, there was enterovirus found in 2 other hospitals in the UK to have become an infestation. So the reason that I've focused my own study on the bacterial pathogens is that the various symptoms that we're looking at for these children, so we're talking about the fact that Lucy's been accused of injecting them with air on the basis that, not because anyone saw her, because nobody saw her inject a baby with air. She's been accused of injecting them with air on the basis that air was found either in their abdomen or in the space outside their abdomen, or in one case in the space that is sort of right towards the back, which is near the spine. Okay, so she's been accused of injecting air, and that somehow the air has travelled to wherever it was supposedly found later. The interesting thing is that several of the bacterial pathogens that I started to investigate, that I've written about on my Substack, have as symptoms that have been recorded in other neonates, caused air to be either collecting in the duodenum and the small intestine, or they've caused air to get into the blood vessels and travel outside of the actual, intestine itself, so into the bloodstream, into what we call the portal veins, the veins that then take the blood from the intestines and run it through the liver, or they've been seen in even more severe cases to have caused air to get into the bloodstream and travel to the heart or to travel to the lungs. So these are things that are documented. They're in the academic literature, and so there are examples out there if anyone wanted to look for them. Similarly, at least 2 of the 3 bacterial pathogens that I looked at are known to cause this, what we call purpura, the little purple spots that they keep talking about. So when they start talking about, there was these little purple spots that came up either on the abdomen or on the extremities, so on the hands and feet. Well, 2 of the pathogens I looked at actually do have a known history for causing these purpura to come up on the skin. And they also disappear, or self-resolve, as we say, within sort of anything from 1 to 4 hours, or maybe by the end of a shift, a nurse will go back and go, oh, the spots have disappeared. So many of the symptoms that are discussed for each of the babies, you can actually go back and look at these bacterial pathogens and find that these bacterial pathogens, especially when they get to the point of causing a condition called NEC, which is necrotizing enterocolitis, when they get to that point, which is the deadly point that mirrors almost some of these, you heard during the trial that, these babies, they crashed and it was an unexpected crash. Well, NEC is known for resulting in these unexpected crashes. That's why we call it a crash. Things stop working. So again, these bacterial pathogens cause NEC, or can cause NEC, which then can cause these unexpected crashes with all of these other symptoms that were discussed. So,
and of course, none of that type of no hypothesis like that was presented to the jury.
Thus far through the transcripts that I've read, and I'm between a half and 2/3 of the way through critically examining the transcripts. It's never been mentioned.
Okay, so, but of course the jury did find her guilty of 7 murders and 7 or 6, depending on which newspapers you read, attempted murders. What do you think was the most convincing piece of evidence against her presented in the case? I mean, there was some talk of this, some sort of written confession or something like that. Can you say something about that?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. We've got that table that we discussed before. Then we've got an interesting thing, which is that the police talked about the fact that when they went to Lucy's home, they found that she had about 100 days worth of handover sheets. Now, that's really, really, really common. I want people to understand out there that it is actually quite common for nurses to have a handover sheet. So you go in, you start your shift, the first 20 minutes, half an hour, you do handover. So the nurse who's been looking after the patients that you're going to be taking for the day will tell you, these are all of the things that we've done with these patients, these are the medications, this is when things are due, the doctor's going to visit at 10 o'clock. So you write it all down on a sheet. Now, some nurses will have a very well set out predefined template that they use. Other nurses will literally just get a piece of paper from the photocopier and write on the back of it. Now, it is very, very common for a lot of nurses to have that sheet folded up in their pocket. Some nurses might give it to the next person they hand over to, but it's very common for nurses to take those sheets home. Now, one of the reasons that we quite often recommend that they take it home goes back to cases like the Lucy Letby case. Because one of the things that came out that helped to demonstrate that there were problems with the patients that she was looking after and that it therefore wasn't murder and why she was acquitted is the fact that she actually had the handover sheets to show these are all the things I was told about the patient and this is what I treated the patient for, right? So it's quite often, and when I talk to, I personally tute nursing students, right? When I talk to them, I tell them, have a handover sheet, have it organised so that you've always got the same information about your patients in the same place every day. Fold that thing up, take it home and keep it. It is also common that, for example, if you've got a patient who's got critical care needs, it is not uncommon for you to get a phone call the next day, halfway through the next shift. So you've been there all night. Somebody rings you up at 10 or 11 o'clock and says, look, this patient has had this problem and this problem and this problem. Do you recall whether or not the doctor saw them last night, or do you recall whether they were given this medicine? The only way you're going to remember that properly is to be able to pull your sheet out and go, yes, actually, I ticked that off on the box.
Yeah. So why was the fact that she had all of these sheets at home considered by the police to be a case for the prosecution?
Well, they thought that what she was doing, what they allege was that what she was doing was keeping them sort of almost as trophies.
Okay.
Right? Okay. So they were alleging she was keeping that as trophies. Right, okay. And what I'm saying is, well, no, actually,
okay.
I can guarantee you that, I know lots of nurses, I know lots of midwives. Many of the nurses and midwives
standard practice. Okay. Then what about this written note that was used against her?
Okay, so another thing that the nurses and midwives are required to do during their training is to keep what are called a reflective journal. Okay, so when they go out on practice, and it's one of the things that in the last 2 or 3 weeks actually I've had to read some of the reflective journals for the students that I supervise. They go out on their placement, they spend so many weeks on a ward. Each day as they do a procedure or as they learn about a new medical condition, they keep a reflective diary about it. So they write down, and they not only do they write down about the medical condition or the treatment that they performed, they might write down comments. We usually encourage them to write down comments about, what did you find easy on the unit? What did you find difficult? How was it working with these different types of people? The doctors, the nurses, whatever. So it becomes this thing that at the end of their placement, we can look at and we can understand, here's what happened for the student. Now, when they go out, they get qualified with NMC every sort of couple of years, and here it's, I believe it's 3 years in the UK. Australia and New Zealand, it's sometimes 3 years and sometimes 5 years, depending on your qualification. You are required to submit a whole heap of documentation to then re-up your practicing certificate. So you've got to show that you've done certain types of training. You've got to demonstrate that you've done certain number of hours of actual work in a particular thing to keep a particular scope of practice. But one of the things you also still have to do is write reflective notes about a couple of patients to be able to present and go, here's a reflective note that describes the path of treatment and the care that I provided for this patient over the course of a week when they were on my unit. Yep. Right? So writing these sort of reflective journal things does become something that nurses and midwives often do. Okay? Not only that, but you've got the fact that, a lot of nurses and midwives obviously are girls. A lot more girls than guys tend to keep a journal or a diary or something like that. what we see from looking at the various screenshots of the ones that were shown in court is the police have gone through and they've picked the 2 or 3, and there's especially this one green one. They've picked the 2 or 3 that appear to be the most damning, and then they've focused on a couple of words.
Right.
Maybe 3 or 4 or 5 words, where she's written something like, I must be evil, or I am evil, I must have killed them, or I killed them. She's written words like that. But when you read the whole note in context, what you see is a young girl who is almost beating herself up. She's self-flagellating. She's whipping herself. You see a young girl who seems to think that had I have been a better nurse, had I been a smarter nurse, had I have had more training, or had I been a better person, I could have saved these babies. And when you read the whole note and you think about the psychology of what she's written, that's what she's doing. She's taking herself to task and blaming herself.
Yeah. Okay. So it was basically sort of a cherry-picking exercise. It may have been by the police for all the journals. Okay.
I wouldn't mind betting that the police found hundreds of pages, and in fact they do allude to the fact that they found considerable amount of journal material.
Yeah.
But what were we shown? All told, as far as I've seen so far in the transcripts, only 3 pages were ever shown.
Yes, it's this case where they're ignoring the absence of evidence in all of the other material,
exactly,
which in itself actually is not evidence of absence. But anyway, that's a separate thing. But okay, so finally, you obviously believe that there presumably are grounds for an appeal. And if so, what would be the next steps? What happens next?
Well, I think what needs to happen is somebody with, obviously a barrister and a team with appeal experience need to come in, and I say that quite cautiously. I think there's one of the potential arguments on appeal could very well end up being, unless we can show why it seems Ben Meyer's hands were tied behind his back, why whether she tied his hands behind his back, whether the judge in voir dire tied his hands behind his back, or whether, as we've since seen, there were a couple of NHS lawyers in the court most of the time, whether they've tied his hands behind his back. I don't know what that backstory is, because all of that sort of voir dire stuff happens behind closed doors. Okay, so it possibly could end up being that one of the appeal grounds could be trial counsel competence. That's not to say Ben was incompetent, but that's to say that that's a way in to get an appeal, is to say, well, look, it's clear that her defence was wanting. There was something wanting about this defence. There's a whole lot of stuff. There's questions that weren't answered. Now, it needs counsel who are experienced on appeals, because appeals on their own are a very tricky and very specific area of jurisprudence, in the same way that you wouldn't let a podiatrist operate on your eye. You wouldn't necessarily go and pick the average solicitor to do your appeal. Now, obviously, as well, I think there's probably no money. And I think that's going to be a limiting factor, because often with appeals, it's the person who's got the money to bring the appeal, because in an appeal situation, whilst you might only have a defendant often only has, some people say 30%, some people say 10% chance of winning in the lower court. When you get to the appeal court, that starts to get bigger. It might be 30%, it might go all the way up to about 60% chance for the defendant. But you've got to have the money, you've got to have the situation where you can make the arguments that are required. So we need the right people. We need, obviously, to be able to, either those people are going to have to donate their time, or we're going to have to find a way to fund them. And then these various issues that are the holes that are starting to come up in the case are going to be the things like, there's going to have to be if the evidence of the other babies that died that Lucy wasn't blamed for, if the evidence regarding those babies wasn't handed over during discovery, then that's a discovery issue. And so whoever does her appeal is going to have to go back and go, right, if these babies weren't disclosed during discovery to Ben Myers, then that's grounds for appeal in and of itself, and those records are going to have to be gotten, and then suitably qualified people are going to have to be brought in to look through those records and go, right, if you've got the 7 babies that Lucy's now found guilty of murdering, and you've then got another 7 babies out of that 30 who died in similar circumstances, but Lucy was never anywhere near them, you've then got a situation where how can you continue to hold Lucy guilty for the 7 babies on such circumstantial evidence if we find that some of the other babies died the same way?
Yeah. Okay, well, thanks very much. Let's hope that justice is seen to be done at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And thanks for the conversation.
Thank you.